Hello, YCUT fans. Hope you're doing well. I'm excited to share with you a new interview with someone very special in the Beatles extended universe. Maclaine Diemer, a multi-talented composer, sound designer, and one of the key people who worked on the Beatles Rock Band video game. I invited Maclaine to share his fascinating behind-the-scenes experience of how this fantastic game got made, and, of course, his love for the Beatles. If you have questions or thoughts to share, let me know in the comments. New YCUT episodes are coming soon, so please stay tuned, and of course, please subscribe if you haven't already. Without further adu, let's meet Maclaine. Maclaine, nice to have you join me. I really appreciate it. I know my audience is going to find this interview super interesting. But first, I think it'd be nice to tell people how we actually connected the first time.
Sure.
Which, believe it or not, was on Paul McCartney's recent AMA on Reddit.
Yeah.
And I saw a post from you responding to some question that someone had asked him, and you mentioned that you worked on Rock Band, the Beatles Rock Band, which is incredibly awesome.
Yeah.
And did Paul respond to a question you asked? I forget.
No, it was. I always come to those things late, but yeah, somebody had asked him a question that I didn't know was that big of a deal until I started working on the Beatles Rock Band, which is, the question was who sings the dreamy, at the in the transition section of A Day in the Life. And, he kind of gave a diplomatic answer. He's also very old, and it was a very long time ago. So I think he kind of muddied the waters a little bit more than helped anybody. But I kind of chimed in with my own thoughts based on a pretty pivotal argument that I had during the making of the Beatles Rock Band, where I ended up losing that fight. But I still don't think the answer is any clearer now, even though we went to the primary source.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I get a lot of questions on video sometimes, like, why don't you just ask Paul for the answer? He's still alive. And it's like, 50 years ago, a lot of drugs at the time. I'm not sure their memories are even the best source,
Yeah, and he's always just so... I mean, they were all kind of like that, just like... you watch interviews with them now, and it's like, those moments are not as important to them as they are to the millions of people around the world. I mean, it's his song, and I'm sure he has very specific memories about things, but it was a decision that I'm sure was made on the spur of the moment in the studio a very long time ago, and why on earth would he remember that? He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who cares about the minutia of his own past,
Right. So anyways, yeah, so that's how we kind of connected. And, I found a little bit more about your history and, your, obviously your work on Beatles Rock Band, but way beyond that, like an accomplished composer, a lot of credits in the video game world. So I'm sure some of the people in my audience have played some of the games you've written for. And I want to get into all that and talk about, that side of things. But I think probably most interesting for my audience off the bat is Beatles Rock Band. If you've played the game, you know how great it is, and it really, I think, brought the Beatles to a younger generation of fans, who got into the game, and that was like their entry into the Beatles, which is super cool. How did you get involved with that project?
I was, at the time, I was playing in bands and things. I was living in Boston at the time that those Guitar Hero and Rock Band games were kind of on their pop culture ascendancy, and the studio that makes those games is called Harmonix Music Systems. The ethos of those games was we want to translate the experience of playing music live, playing an instrument, and being in a band to people that don't play instruments or know how to make music. And so they needed people who did that thing and then sort of train them on how to make this game, and make sure that they were authentically replicating the experience of playing a guitar or playing the drums or playing the bass or whatever. So they were hiring, instead of hiring people out of like people who are programmers, or hiring them out of some sort of specialty program designed for game developers. They just wanted people. They wanted people who were in bands, and they were hiring fairly aggressively. And so I happened to be in a band with a couple guys who worked at the studio at the time. This was probably 2008 or so when I first got hired there. And that Rock Band 1 had just come out and had done very well, so they needed more people. One of the guys in the band knew that I was interested in getting into games, and offered to pass along my resume in the audio department. And I mean, my resume, right, which is like I'd worked at Trader Joe's and tried not to get fired on Friday nights when I would, ask if I could have the night off to play a show. The job itself was to transcribe the music into those colored patterns that scroll at you on screen, right? So I took a test doing that, did a pretty good job, I think, and got hired, and that was kind of a moment that changed my life.
So I guess it brings us to then the Beatles. Like, did you hear about it one day that like they're gonna acquire the Beatles for Rock Band? I mean, that's a big get.
Yeah. So I remember very specifically how it happened. I think I'd been at the studio maybe a month at most, probably less than a month. It was very, very early on that after I'd gotten hired, and I was just in the kitchen or in some sort of public area, and there was a side conversation happening between a few people. And, I'm trying not to like rock the boat because I'm so new there. All this, the company was huge when I got there and continued to grow. There was a couple hundred people, I think maybe 250 when I started. So there was a lot of people, and there's social cliques, and there was things I didn't navigate, and I'm kind of a shy person, especially back then. And so I was trying to just sort of get the lay of the land because I'd never had a job that I really loved. I'd always worked at Trader Joe's or like worked in an office and done things that I was just happy to clock in and clock out and be able to pay my rent. So I was trying to figure out, okay, my life is different now. What's this all about? Like, I'm surrounded by cool people now. Somebody was having a conversation where they said, blah, 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 something about P9. I remember that very specifically. They called it P9. And I was like, hey, what's P9? And they said, oh, that's Project 9. They're like, we're working on a Beatles game. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. First of all, I was like, great code name, Project 9, of course. We love the number 9 if we're Beatles fans. But so that would have been in 2008, and the game released in September of 2009. So it was a ways out. And what I learned very shortly after was that they were kind of making the game on faith. They were hoping that the pull of this, like I said, this sort of pop culture zeitgeist would appeal to them enough that they would be able to secure the rights to the music. So at that point they had been developing art assets and I think building prototype levels without the permission of the Beatles and without access to any of the official music, just as a pitch to them, because there's layers of people you have to go up, but at the very end, you've got to get 4 yeses from 4 very specific and important people, and they will see what you've worked on. So, there was this sort of small core team at the studio that was secretly working on this in the hopes that we could make it, and it was like maybe 6 or 8 months later that we, meaning the studio, finally secured the rights, like signed the contract to make the game.
So really, the idea came from the Harmonix side, not from the Beatles.
Yeah. I think they thought, hey, we've got something good going, and they started pitching it to a lot of different bands. There were specialty games that came out, like the Guitar Hero side of things from Activision. They made Van Halen Guitar Hero, I think. I think before the split happened, there might have been an Aerosmith Guitar Hero. And then on the Harmonix side, they made a Green Day rock band. And I know that they pitched it to Led Zeppelin. And that got pretty close, but I think it took so long that the game's sales had started to dip and it was no longer as a big of a hit as it once was. And I think the band kind of balked at that. I would have loved to have seen that. That would have been amazing. But so anyway, so the Beatles were part of that. And I think they just were like, hey, we might only have one shot to secure this kind of band, but let's aim high,
I'm thinking now, looking back, that was around the time they were working on like their remasters, I think, of all the albums. I'm sure that helped motivate.
I think that was a big part of it. I think that the sort of cross promotional synergy, they're both the surviving band members and the widows and the organization that is the Beatles, they're savvy. They know that they are sitting on a gold mine at all times, and that everything they do is guaranteed to be a huge success, right? So I think they were looking for ways to, like you said, promote it to kids, basically, is really what it was all about. Secure another generation of Beatles fanatics that will buy anything that they put out. The game came out September 9th, 2009, right? So 9/9/09. But I think that I'll have to look back. Maybe you know this, but I'm pretty sure that's when the remastered box sets came out. But then I have a memory now of us having them in the studio before the game came out. So I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty...
You might have had a pre-release copy of them. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe.
It was definitely around that same time, though. You're right. I mean, it must have been timed on purpose.
It was all part of the same sort of wave of Beatles stuff happening then. That was something that made the decision easier because Giles Martin, right, George Martin's son, was actively in the studio going over these old tapes and digitizing them and drawing out, like using technological wizardry to extract more than I think anybody thought possible from these old tapes where, some of the stuff predates any sort of multi-tracking. So it's pretty miraculous what we were able to get to make the game, let alone, hear these updated versions of songs we all know by heart.
What was it like? Were you just handed a set of digital masters with all these stems laid out, or was there like work you had to do to organize this stuff? I mean, how did it come to you?
It was very secretive, and this is sort of, I wish that I was a little bit more senior at the company so that I could have been a little bit more involved in that side, because it was so like protected. Only a handful of people were able to go to Abbey Road and sit in the studio with Giles and talk about what we needed to make the game. And I was not one of those people. Unfortunately, I was like, maybe I'll get to meet Paul and Ringo, and a couple people did, and I didn't. I did get to meet Danny Harrison. He came into the studio once, which was great. And I walked by Yoko once when she was in the studio because she was there visiting. But yeah, in terms of what we needed, it's tricky because obviously more than half their catalog is done, on 4-track at best, and we needed a lot of separation. So they had to figure out a way to use noise gates and EQs and filters and things to split everything out as much as possible, right? The way the game actually works is the system that they use is called mute unmute. That's what they call it internally in the studio. And basically, when you are successfully playing the patterns, when you're matching them, the timing of them on screen, you are constantly keeping the tracks unmuted. It's almost like you're sort of spinning plates up in the air. And the second you sort of miss a window to correctly hit a button at the right time, the track it defaults to its muted state. And so, we had to get a bass track, but it's like if the bass is mixed in with the drums, well, where is most of the bass frequency concentrated? Let's filter out everything else and see how that sounds in a full mix. If we separate out all these different layers, and one of them is the bass layer, if we pull that out, what does it sound like? And it's not as perfect as it is with some of the other stuff that we have much more clean multi-tracks of, but it worked well enough. It worked surprisingly well. At the very least, you would know when the bass was missing and that you were doing poorly and that you should get back on track. And so, yeah, they had to do stuff like that, especially for the early stuff. After they get to, maybe not Sgt. Pepper's, but some of like White Album stuff, to the last two or three albums, I think were a little bit easier for them to get.
Yeah, right.
What was interesting, I thought, was the tapes are literally kept in vaults with live security guards, because this stuff is truly like invaluable. And I'm sure that somebody had digitized it a long time ago, so it's not like when they were sitting in the studio with Giles, there was a tape on the machine behind them spinning. But it still was very sort of protected, and in order to prevent the stems from leaking out at the time, what they sent us to do our transcriptions from were like crazy low resolution, like the poorest quality MP3s you can imagine, with just a ton of aliasing and garbled stuff, but enough to be able to make out the parts. And then we would reference it listening to full stereo mixes. But if you listen to Please Please Me bass track, it was very bad sounding. It was like a multi-generation thing, but it was just because they were so worried about this stuff leaking out. Obviously, that didn't matter because it's all leaked out anyway, because people just got the disc and hacked it and extracted it. Yeah. But I think, I remember being in the studio listening to some of this stuff on its own before it had gotten through the hands of the mixers, and being like, it sounds better. Like no one will ever hear that version except for Giles Martin and then us in the studio. So I did that with every song in the game. I was like, I got to hear this stuff. This is another thing I probably shouldn't say if the lawyers are out there listening, but I definitely debated like trying to figure out how I could do that late at night and record it so that I could take it home and listen to it. I never did. I was very tempted, but I didn't. And now, of course, it's all on YouTube. It doesn't matter.
So I'm curious, were there any songs you got from Abbey Road that simply weren't in condition to make into the game, or they just didn't make sense as tracks? Like, I guess it's a question about track selection in general. What led you to pick the songs that ended up in the game?
Yeah, that was a tough one because, I wasn't the only sort of super fan at the studio, and there were people like, oh, you got to have this song, you got to have this song. And there was kind of internal news groups that acted as message boards for people in the studio, and that's where these big chat threads would be. It was kind of a predecessor to Slack, right? But it was how we all communicated with each other. And there was a whole subsection of Beatles rock band threads, and one of them was about song selection. Most of that stuff had been locked in place before I got there, unfortunately, because I really wish I had some input. But they had to do, it had to satisfy the core criteria for Rock Band, like is it fun for all instruments to play? The Beatles Rock Band was also the game that debuted the singing mechanic and harmonizing. That was a big selling point. In addition to the music, that stuff eventually found its way into Rock Band 3 and all the games since then. So it had to be like fun for multiple people to sing, fun for every instrument to play, and then they had to represent an equal number of the Beatles, right? So all four people had to be represented equally, or as equal as you can. It had to represent every era pretty well. And then it had to be a mix of like what casual fans and hardcore fans would know, right? Yeah. So that's a pretty complicated criteria. But fortunately, they've got hundreds of songs, whatever it is, 260 whatever songs. So there's a lot to choose from. I think the game shipped with 50. And then there was also the sort of not backup plan, but like the secondary plan, which is the game comes out as a hit. What can we release what DLC can we release to keep things going in terms of individual songs or complete albums? So, I don't envy the person who had to start axing things. I came in kind of lobbying hard for some B-side stuff and some of the singles. Not many of which made it on there. I was really disappointed that Rain didn't make it on there. I was like, I really wanted Rain because I'm like, come on, this song's so awesome, but how would you sing the backwards stuff? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how you would do that. So that was the criteria essentially. And I think that, I think they did a really good job of representing a kind of crash course in their story, both musically and literally. I mean, the other thing that it had to satisfy was like, how can we represent these eras in the game? And it's easy when it was the live things, because you can just say, you can look at the Ed Sullivan footage and just recreate that in Rock Band. But then after they stopped touring, how do you represent that stuff? And it was all sort of it was a big puzzle. And every choice you make is going to either impress or disappoint somebody, right? Because it's so special to so many people. Yeah.
I'm curious too. You say, imagining the setups for these things. Were there, designers assigned to the project that you would work with and say like, hey, I think, if the band were playing in a room, they were doing Revolution, like it would kind of look like this, or, how did you help shape that? Like,
the core of the art team at Harmonix has always been very strong, and they've always had very strong artists that have come through there. And some of them were Beatles fans, some of them weren't, but they're all really talented in terms of picking up minutia and details. So it started with them doing concepts and seeing how can we translate real world scenarios to the sort of simplified cartoonish game that we make. Unfortunately, the band lends itself well to that kind of translation. They've it's been so long, and every moment of their career is so iconic that it's become a mythology. Like it's transcended reality, and even them in suits on Ed Sullivan has this like larger than life kind of essence to it that is easy to capture artistically. So they started, it started with them concepting what scenarios would work, and then they had people who were experts in costumes, not just like almost like theatrical costume designers, right? Except for digital, games. And so they would look at reference photos and footage of them playing on Ed Sullivan and get all the details right about their collars and the buttons and how high their cuffs were off their boots and all that stuff. I mean, they were maniacal about it. And then so I was actually one of two people who requested this. It's funny, he's one of my best friends now. I've known him for forever. But he and I both asked this independently of the audio director. We went to the audio director and said, look, the Beatles are more to us than just a band, and this is a cool project we're going to be doing for the next year. I have to do more in this game than just transcribe songs into little colored patterns. I've got to put something more of myself into it, because this if I never make another video game ever again, I'll die happy, because my name has a very small, hook attached to the official Beatles legacy. I'm in there somehow. And that is one of the most important things I think I could ever do, at least with my career. So I said, okay, well, why don't you become I forget what term we're credited as, but we're sort of design or historical consultants or something like that. But we were basically in charge of doing this final pass of deciding, who's playing what instrument in what era, on what song, who's singing. And this is what led to the AMA, kerfuffle, which is who's singing what, who's playing what, during what song during this era, all that kind of stuff. So we were just maniacally researching, when was Paul playing the Rickenbacker? When was George playing the Rosewood Telecaster? All that stuff. When was Ringo playing with tea towels on his drums? When was he not? And were they playing Voxes? Were they playing Fenders? All that stuff. So that was, it was me and one of my best friends. His name is Amin Zarukian. Great name, Amin. He and I, we would constantly go back and forth, and we would pore over any book we could find, and troll through YouTube.
Yeah, you must have had to consult so many sources. I mean, some of this stuff is also, a lot of it's inconsistent, the record.
Very and so that
really dig deep.
Yeah, those moments where we had to make judgment calls were tricky, because you do have to fudge some stuff, right? But I think at that point, it had been out for maybe a year, less than a year. Was the sort of holy grail for us, at least in terms of gear, was the Recording the Beatles book, which you can't find anymore. It costs $500 if you want to buy it now, which is stupid.
It's a substantial book. Yeah.
I know. I should have bought it back then. I mean, I was poor and young, and even in the years since then, I could have had a copy. Even for $150, I would spend that now compared to what it costs on Amazon for a used copy. But the studio had bought a copy of that book, and we would just go through it maniacally. Obsessively looking for. Sometimes it would literally be a one sentence that would be aha, there it is. There's the information. And the same with Mark Lewison's Recording the Beatles. The Beatles tape sessions, the complete Beatles tape sessions.
I think I've got it back here. It's a classic.
Yeah, I mean, it's old. One of the oldest books, I think, that's more than just cash in on their, tab. It's not. It's the oldest non-tabloid version of their story. But I mean, that book is the Bible. It's it's so unbelievably detailed, and so that was the book that I used to try to make my case that it's not John singing on A Day in the Life. It's Paul, because it says it in that book, and I believe that book.
Let's talk about that one specifically.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
This has been. I mean, it's one of the most popular videos on the channel.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there's a debate, and a heated debate still.
Sure.
I, to be honest, went back and forth on it myself. I can hear both of their voices if I am listening and imagining them, and that's probably the magic of their harmony, is that they really can kind of embody each other. But so I've heard people argue this endlessly. What were you thinking when you had to make this call? Because this is a serious decision. It's going to a video game. It's going to be around forever.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I'll walk you through my process. I was QCing everything. I was just looking over, the video. I was letting the game kind of autoplay and watching what was going on. And in the game still, I mean, if you played it today and you played that song, John is the one singing it, because somebody at some point made a decision that it was John. I was not that person. So I was the guy that was like, stop the presses, and I went running to the game director, and I'm like, it's not John, it's Paul. And I will also admit that for years I thought it was John, because Buried in the Mix, you know, I'm listening to like the versions of the albums that I grew up with were cassette tape recordings that my dad had made off of a friend's vinyl. Like a buddy of my dad's in the Navy in the 80s had the like half-speed master versions of all the albums on vinyl. And so he made cassette tape copies of them. And up until even in high school in the late 90s, that's what I was listening to. You know, it was like mowing the lawn, listening to Magical Mystery Tour. So in terms of, you know, generational sort of fidelity to the original, I was several generations removed. And, you know, those are ancient masters at this point, like, just like doesn't sound that good. So to my ear, I was like, oh, it just sounds like John. And part of it is there is a range that all of them have similar tonalities to their voice, right? And then the big thing is the delay, right? The delay on the voice is such a John thing, that slapback delay. And you hear it, it's at its loudest is when it first comes in, before it starts to drift off and the orchestra rising stuff kind of covers it up. But when you hear it in isolation, to my ear, it becomes clear that it's Paul, and it's in that second phrase, right? So the first phrase, I will 100% admit that it sounds like John. The second phrase is such a Paul phrase, both in terms of the agility of his vocals and the little embellishments that he does is so Paul. I'm like, never in the entire history of every Beatles record has John ever sang anything that sounded anything like this. And you can find many instances of things where Paul sounds like that. So either John started it and Paul finished it, which is, you know, not very logical, or Paul started it and because of, you know, the raspiness maybe of that particular take and the delay on his voice, it sounds, and because you know that John is coming back, right? You listen to the song a million times, your imagination starts to fill in the gaps. Does it make more sense that John is recording a part that's going to fade out even though his part is coming back in, or does it make more sense that Paul is doing the outro to his own section, right? So that was my logic going through it all. And like I said, I listened to it and I'm like, I got to confirm this somehow. And that was when I found the entry in the Lewison book. I'm like, okay, good. This guy probably knows better than I do. I'm just using my ears. This guy's like listening to the actual tapes. So I went to the game director and I'm like, no, it's not John, it's Paul. And he kind of was like, too late, kid, you know, because of the system that they used for lip syncing. What they would do is they actually, this is much more common now that you see if you look at behind the scenes movie stuff, in terms of performance capture, right? Put all those dots on people's faces and put certain specific cameras on them, track the dots, turn that into digital information, and then graft it onto a 3D model. So I think I could be misremembering this, but I think they found people who looked, or at least had similar facial structures to the Beatles. They might have actually used like a tribute band. I think for the physical animations of their bodies moving, they actually motion captured a tribute band. Because they, you know, are so used to moving the right way and being able to play lefty and do this kind of stuff. So cool. I think they used them for the facial capture as well. Huh. And they had the performance capture they had gotten was the John guy. And it was easier to translate that to the John model than it would be to take all that information and put it on the Paul model. And it's not one-to-one. It's not like you can just plop it in there. Even after you put the information onto the John model, an actual character animator has to get in there and fix things so that it looks natural, because all sorts of, you know, things might be moving in weird ways. So a person has to fix all that stuff. So it was just too late. And it's one of my greatest video game development regrets is that I couldn't make that right, you know, at least some sort of definitive version, in my opinion and the opinion of other people. I know it's a divisive issue.
You've inadvertently helped perpetuate.
I know, that's why I feel so guilty. I'm like, no, we had a chance to fix this. And then it was funny.
People will cite Rock Band and say, "Hey, it's in the Rock Band game."
I know. I hate it. I hate that. It's such a blemish on that legacy. And that's what's funny about the Paul AMA thing is that, you know, when he said, "I think we were all singing," I'm like, he's just blowing off this question. And then now, actually watching your video and listening again, you totally hear other voices in there, just trying to find harmonies, and it's like they're, they sort of. I do this now when I'm working. If you are not 100% committed to the musical idea, you'll kind of come in strong and then be like, oh, and back off a little bit, and you can hear them doing that. They're not quite sure what they're supposed to be singing, so they kind of don't really sing anything, and it's so tucked in the mix that you'd never hear it in the full mix. So I think that's what he's remembering. It would have been nice if he was like, yeah, we were all there, but I'm pretty sure I sang it. I wanted that clarity. We'll never get it.
And there's so much little stuff like that too in the rest of their catalog where it's like it really could go either way. And I'm not sure they remember. I'm not sure there's good enough records to really say one is definitive or not. But that one in Day in the Life is really, it's one that gets people really heated.
Okay, so, if anybody wants to @me on Twitter, I will. I'll take the heat. I'll take the heat, and I'll go 10 rounds that it was Paul.
What was your? What would you say your favorite song was from that collection?
Ticket to Ride is so much fun to play on drums. It's the best. I mean, because I'm a guitar player, that's sort of my instrument. But Rock Band, it literally taught me how to play drums, because when I started at the studio, I was a terrible drummer. And, even though it's only 3 of your limbs, really, it doesn't, there's no hi-hat pedal on the sort of default kit. It teaches you that independence of limbs. If you're playing on expert mode, you're playing pretty much the real drum part, unless it's some kind of crazy, Neil Peart Rush thing that they have to sort of dumb down to 4 pads and a kick drum. But Ticket to Ride, it's just fun. It's just a fun song to play, on drums at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Oh Darling, I loved singing Oh Darling. But it's funny, if you try to sing Oh Darling like he does with that throaty growl, it craps out the game. The technology used to recognize your pitch doesn't respect that. So you have to kind of sing oh darling, you have to very specifically hit it. But if you're like, what you told me, you see the little arrow going woo 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 all over the screen.
What a cool project to work on, not just working with the music, but really working with how to make the music.
Yeah.
It's a totally different perspective on the Beatles. And I think for anybody who's played the game, it really takes you to a whole other level, an appreciation of what goes into them composing the songs and playing them, and
absolutely
all the magic there. So
I think that beyond just the specific songs, all of the bass parts, I know this, right, because I've listened to the music, and this, and hardcore fans know this. But Paul is an unbelievable bass player. Still to this day, he's one of the greatest of all time. He's so great. And, in the earlier recordings, some of that stuff gets buried, and unless you're really picking it out. And that was one of the things that the remasters, I think, helped with people understand. Paul had just gotten flack for so many years for being a big sap, and everybody was all on the John and the George train, and I have my own opinions about who's my favorite and why. But, I'm a Paul guy, and I think that he is truly the, keystone of the whole thing. And I think that the years have proven that. I think that he was much more fundamental than just the big sap that wrote cheeseball novelty songs. And part of it is that he's probably the best musician in the whole group, right? And his bass playing is such an unbelievable expression of his talent. And I think it wasn't really until those box sets came out. I remember reading a review that specifically pointed out what a revelation his bass playing was, because you could finally hear it, especially on the early stuff, when, not only is he trying to capture in the studio, but he had to do that live and look into the camera. I still can barely play without looking at my hands all the time. And for him to play that stuff while, grinning at the camera in the crowd is unbelievable. So, like I said, being there to witness people have these realizations about it and see their opinions change about the band or about individual members of the band, I think was, a special part of making that game.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, what an awesome thing to be a part of, no doubt. So after the game comes out, it's released, what were you working on next? Did you stay at Harmonix for a while, or did you want to move on to something different?
The game came out in 2000, like I said, 2009, fall 2009. The studio itself operated on a pretty intense cycle, where one of those games had to come out every year, in addition to weekly downloadable, content for the game. So the sort of peak years of those games were very intense from a production standpoint. And we probably finished our part, the audio department, and most of the production was finished by late spring, I would say, because then you have to go through all these certification processes with Sony and Microsoft and Nintendo, because it came out for the Wii, and deal with manufacturing the instruments and just basically making sure that boxes are going to be on the shelves come Black Friday. Basically, you got to make sure that you can supply the world. But we were already done. So when the game came out, we were already working on Rock Band 3 at that point. And I was happy to be working on that. I mean, it had an interesting new challenge in that they were adding keyboards to that particular game, and also the real guitar. They needed people like me who were guitar players to there was sort of an elite level of guitar players who were like, okay, we're doing real guitar stuff, so you have to transcribe this stuff for real into the game, and that was a little bit more complicated. So that was kind of a fun challenge that kept me engaged with making that game. I mentally was already starting to be like, all right, the job's getting a little repetitive, and I'm not sure that this is something that I can do forever. And then there was also kind of personal life things that came into play where I at that point I'd been living in Boston for so long. I was like, I got to get out of this place. I'm not from there originally, and I'd had my fill, to put it nicely. And so I was kind of looking to see what else I could do. So I helped, I finished Rock Band 3. We wrapped that up in the spring of 2010. And I started looking elsewhere. I wanted to see what I could do next. And I was really happy to be working in games, so I wanted to stay in games, but see where that could take me. What was my sort of next adventure. And at that point I was 29, and so still young, but unattached, ready for something and ready to go at a moment's notice. So I was applying to places all over the world for a sound design job. That was kind of what I consider myself. Like, our titles at Harmonix were composer / sound designer, and we didn't really do either of those things. But it was just kind of an easy default for anyone who was in the audio department. We were mostly like data entry. That's how I described it. Musical data entry. So I wanted to do actual sound design. I thought that was going to be my career. My background was in music. I studied music in school and had been in bands and stuff like that. But that's a difficult thing to say. I'm going to pay the rent with music. I mean, it's very challenging. It's not a meritocracy. So even the most talented people can fail to make a living at it. So doing sound design, I thought was great. It sort of utilized a similar skill set. You have to listen. There's technical aspects that cross over. So I was going to just pursue sound design as my career, and that eventually took me to Seattle to work at a studio called ArenaNet. ArenaNet, very difficult name to say. They sort of work on a game franchise called Guild Wars, which is popular, in that field that it is, right? It's a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And for people that don't know what that means or don't know what Guild Wars is, it's basically like World of Warcraft. When I say that, people are like, oh, okay, I get it. But it's that type of game where it's always online. It's a persistent world. You can log in 24/7 and play the game with people all over the world. It's a pretty amazing social experience, I should say, not experiment, but an experiment as well. Yeah. So they made Guild Wars 1 and a couple of expansions for that, and were in the run up to releasing Guild Wars 2, which was a big deal. And they needed help, kind of the same way I got into Harmonix working at Rock Band. It's like they were desperate for help, and I expressed interest and interviewed well, and yeah, they flew me out there and relocated me. I mean, it was like from the time they reached out to me to the time that I was living in Seattle and starting the job was 2 weeks. It was like I took the phone interview in my car in the parking lot at Harmonix, and 2 weeks later I was living in Seattle. So I did that for a while, just making sound effects, spell casting sounds, and bows and arrows shooting, and trebuchets collapsing, and all sorts of stuff like that.
How were you doing that? Was this all like MIDI sound libraries and picking things? Were you actually like physically making these sounds?
Yeah, it's about half and half. I think sometimes you just need the sound of, to like someone dropping a car from 100 feet up in a junkyard, and that's not something that we could do. So you buy a sound library that has that sound in it. But the audio team at the time especially was very active, and they still are. But there was 5 of us at the time. We were very active about going out and recording our own sounds. If you meet any sound designer, you know that, and you can. I still have a little bit of this. Now it's sort of musical, but anybody who does sound design for a living is like a hoarder, right? They just like any broken piece of junk that's lying around. You're like, cool, this is going to make an awesome sound later, and then you just have a closet full of broken things that eventually you'll get around to recording. So we were all the same. We just had a collection of weird and interesting things, and you put a microphone on it, you pitch it down, you reverse it, and put some distortion on it, and all of a sudden it sounds like a dragon,
Do you ever play something you've created, hear something, and think, oh, why didn't I do this?
All the time. I hear stuff all the time that I made sounds for, and I'm like, oh, I definitely would do that differently now. But you know what? Who in a creative field doesn't feel that way about their old work? If somebody points out that the Emperor has no clothes and this sound really sucks, all you can do is just sort of say sorry, and hopefully make the next one better.
I can't say how many videos where I wish I could go back now and totally change, the way I scripted something or made a mistake, and I can't go back and fix it. And so, yeah, you have to live with it and embrace it. But the flip side to that is, there's someone out there who's hearing this, and for them it becomes like it's important to them, like it's part of their memory. And I think audio in particular, like childhoods are defined by the things you hear in video games, on TV, and whatever. So there's kids who've grown up listening to your work who, like, that's part of them, and that's got to be really fulfilling in a way.
Yeah,
right?
and it gives you some perspective. I mean, I've learned to not constantly present my work with caveats or apologies. I don't think that it needs to go the other direction and just always have a bunch of hubris and be really egotistical about your own work. I think it's important to have perspective on it, but part of that perspective means it's probably not as good as you think, but it's also probably not as bad as you think, right? And so keep those thoughts about how bad you think it is to yourself, and let that motivate the next thing, and just keep working. It's all about momentum and just keeping yourself productive. This stuff can be really deeply meaningful to people, and that's actually one thing I've learned over the years. Maybe we'll get to this, but eventually I transitioned out of doing sound design into doing music for the game, which is even more personal than just spell casting sound effects and things like that. That's like touching something ineffable in people, right? Like a deep emotional core. And I have trouble listening back to my old work. I mean, some of it I like, and I'm like, it's pretty good. And some of it I wince at when I hear it. But in my years of working on the game and meeting fans, this is a significant part of their life. They've dedicated their money, they've dedicated their time. They have deep relationships, whether it's friendships or romantic relationships. Like, this game can be important on a fundamental level to people in a way that it's fundamentally important to me, but in a different way, right? Like, obviously, it's a big part of my life. Working on the game changed my life for the better. It sort of allowed me to do all the things I've ever dreamed of doing. But it's still my job, and so for some people, it's their escape from life. It's the thing that brings them joy in a way that nothing else does, and that's very sacred. You have to treat that with respect, even if you don't feel the same way about it. You have to honor that, and so I've learned to cherish when people come up and say those things to me.
Absolutely, I totally agree. You mentioned too your transition into composing, into scoring and that sort of thing. What got you into that? And that's like a big leap, I would say, from sound design. And so, what drew you toward that?
I was working at the studio doing sound design. They made a decision to bring the sort of composition for the game in-house. They wanted to kind of mix it up a little bit. And my audio director, boss, came to me and said, hey, you're the music guy. Why don't you come up with a list of names of some other composers who we can reach out to and talk to them about working on music for the game? So, I said, sure, gladly. And in earnest, I started making this list. And, I spent like one evening, I stayed after late just thinking about things and, looking up on YouTube examples of people's work and whatever. And I got maybe 4 names deep, and all of a sudden it was just like the light bulb went off over my head. And I thought, this is probably opportunity knocking as loud as it will ever knock in my entire life, to do this thing that I have dreamt of since I was a child, the thing that I've wanted more than anything, which is to make music for a living. And I kind of had this moment of both like excitement and anxiety of, if I don't at least ask to be able to take over the music, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life, because I don't know if I'll ever get this chance ever again. Because I hadn't had that chance at any other point, despite how hard I had tried, to sort of put myself in a position to make this work. So, I thought about it for a little bit longer, a couple more days maybe or something. And then I went to my boss and said, hey, look, I don't have a demo reel. I don't have any way to prove to you that I can do this, because the music for the game is very lush, orchestral, Lord of the Rings sounding film. It sounds like a movie score basically. And I didn't have that at all in my portfolio. I didn't even study that in school. I mean, I went to music school, but I thought I was going to be a rock star, so I didn't go there for film scoring, which is sort of the traditional path, to learn composition, orchestration, studying the masters, studying, film scores. I didn't do any of that stuff. So difficult to make your case if that's the kind of background you're coming from. But I went to him and I said, look, I can't prove to you right now that I can do this. I'm confident that I can do it. Like, the music is up here. I can hear it in my head. I just, I need a little bit of time to figure out how to get it out, out in the world. So let me try to prove it to you that I can make this happen. Eventually, after a few months, I got better at the tools. I cranked out a piece of music that I was happy with, and I put it in front of him and said, hey, what do you think of this? And he said, wow, holy, whatever, this is amazing. Let's put it in the game. And when I listen back to that piece now, I'm like, yikes, this is not good. I would not have hired me if this was what I had submitted. And to their credit, at the studio, they liked it, and I've been writing music for them ever since. So, they took a chance on me, and I'm forever in their debt. It was, a pivotal moment in my life, among many pivotal moments.
I'm curious too about composition, original composition, and I've read that you've cited some of your influences, like John Williams, some of these other legendary directors or legendary composers. Do you ever worry that you're writing something that is too close to something you've actually heard, and it ends up in your piece? And I'm thinking like a parallel to like the whole George Harrison kerfuffle, right?
Yeah.
With My Sweet Lord, where it's like, clearly he didn't sit down one day and rip off, another song, but it ends up happening because it's just part of what you've probably heard. So does that ever happen for you? Do you ever catch yourself and you're like, damn, that's straight out of Star Wars. I can't use that.
I'm not the first person to say this or be in this situation, but like, there's only so many notes and there's only so many combinations of things, and it would be very egotistical of me to think that I could ever be the first to do anything. You know what I mean? At least anything listenable or anything that's in the realm of the kind of music that I like to make. Every once in a while, if I find that it is a little close, there's ways to mask it. There's certain techniques of just like change the rhythm a little bit, change it from a minor to a major chord or modulate or whatever. There's like I said, you have your bag of tricks that you can sort of dive into. But I do have moments sometimes where it'll remind me of something, but it's because I listen to a lot of music. And like I said, there's only so many combinations of things. So like there's one specific moment I remember, not even John Williams or classical, where I was working on something and I was trying to add in some more interesting chords than just standard like major minor stuff. And I was throwing in a couple extra notes. And I realized that, I work stuff out on a piano. So I realized as I was doing it, I'm like, why do those chords sound so familiar? It's just two chords going back and forth. And then I'm like, wait a second. Those are the exact same chords from Kool and the Gang's Summer Madness. Which my version of it, especially when I listen to it now, it couldn't sound any different than that. I mean, in so many ways, except that it's the same two chords that go back and forth to each other. But no one would hear one and hear the other and be like, hey man, did you rip off Summer Madness for this track? Like, no one would do that. Except it just, tickled something in my brain. I'm like, okay, but I took it off in this direction, and I didn't start saying like, today I'm going to rip off Summer Madness for my beautiful, full orchestral score.
Have you ever put anything in intentionally, like an Easter egg? Have you ever, like, Hello Goodbye is in a score to something, but you wouldn't know. You only kind of put it in because you wanted it.
That's very tempting. No, I've never gotten that brazen. I mean, most of what I do, at least for Guild Wars, is the soundtrack is very much in the same vein as Star Wars, or just that sort of Wagner tradition of leitmotifs, right? Like associating little melodic bits or phrases with characters or moments. So, I've been working on the game for so long, I have a very large library of these sort of things to draw from. And that is part of the fun, is figuring out how to weave those in sometimes. And there are people who take the music very seriously and will dissect it and pull out that stuff and try to figure out, why certain choices were made or what's being hinted at subtly with the music. And, they don't always get it right. Sometimes you can have a couple leaps in logic where I'm like, I wasn't thinking that day. The only thing I was thinking was I got to get this done by 7, or something like that. Yeah. But a lot of times I do put, I try to put a lot of thought into everything I do if I have the time. And it is kind of rewarding for even, there's like on Reddit and a couple of message boards, there's like 5 people that just take this stuff so seriously. And, I don't do it for them, but I am happy when they kind of get it, if they can uncover a little Easter egg.
All right, we'll have to look out for some. Now that I've mentioned it to you.
Yeah, maybe I'll sneak in Hello Goodbye and
All right, but this has been awesome. Before I let you go, I do want to do a quick speed round. Beatles speed round.
Okay,
right?
hit me.
So let's rattle these off. I think you already alluded to this, but your favorite Beatle?
Paul.
Got to be Paul. Okay,
it's got to be Paul.
Heard that. Top 3 favorite songs?
I love some of the weirder ones. So like, I love. Hey Bulldog, I think that's an awesome song. I actually love It's All Too Much. That's one of my favorite songs. It's just so, I don't know. It's like, I don't know. It's just like, it's so out there. The sort of the feedback and the organ drones. It's one of my favorite George songs, bar none, and one of my favorite Beatles songs. And then, either All You Need Is Love or Hey Jude. That's sort of, I'm hedging a little bit. It's 4, but All You Need Is Love is one of those ones where it's so simple and so beautiful and so direct, and it just is like the perfect synergy, I think, of what they were all about. And it's like, John is so cynical, and that's part of his appeal. But when he drops that, he can almost be more sentimental than Paul, I think, and more, and that expression of saying all you need is love in such simple and plain terms is so John and so direct, and it's like it hits a little bit harder. So I'll say that. So I'll say that instead of Hey Jude. I like All You Need Is Love.
I think those are 3 solid choices.
Okay.
Okay. Next, favorite album.
I think it's the White Album. Yeah, love the White Album, even though it has Wild Honey Pie on it.
And then how about least favorite album?
Whatever the second one is called, I always forget. The one that's just a bunch of covers that are just sort of uninspired.
Oh. It's confusing because, like, in the beginning, they have the UK ones and the US ones.
I don't think about the US ones. Don't count. The second UK
Beatles,
album,
right?
Yeah.
Please Please Me and With the Beatles. Yeah, the early ones kind of all melt together as sort of.
I mean, I love Please Please Me. Okay. I think it's such an unbelievable debut. I just think that they had a little bit of a sophomore slump. It's like as minor as it can be, but they just sort of hit. Is that the one that has Mr. Moonlight on it? I hate that song so much.
I think it's Beatles for Sale. That's like the 3rd or 4th one.
Okay, well, I like that one, but there's something about the second one where it's like half covers. It just doesn't do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair to them, they're in the studio for probably a day, and they have to cram all this stuff in, and then go back on tour. And they weren't really thinking much.
Yeah,
about it,
follow it up, it's I don't envy them, and they made up for it later on, obviously.
Agreed. For sure. Well, Maclaine, this has been a pleasure.
Pleasure's all
really
mine.
Enjoyed chatting. I know we could go for hours longer. Maybe we'll have you back someday.
I would love to
talk more in depth. I don't know if there's any other stories or tidbits you want to leave us with. From your work on that or any other Beatles stuff that's relevant to you, but
like I said, I think about that time very fondly, and I'm happy to have played my small part in it, and I don't know. Again, I'm not the first person to say this, but the enduring power of that band and their message and their music, I think, is so incredible. And the fact that it can, continue to find new ways to present itself for new generations, I think, speaks to the testament of is a testament to its power. So anyway, I don't know. All you need is love. That's all I have to say.
That's a good note to leave with. Keep on making amazing music.
Thanks so much.